Welcome to part 1 of this Nordic-themed edition of Stories Lost. In this episode, I will present all our stories set in the Nordic countries between 1930 and 1950. Before each segment, I'll share a few thoughts about the events or the process of creating the episode. We begin in Sweden with the ghost flyers of the 1930s, which also lead us on a detour to 1930s Canada. While some of the ghost flyer incidents are now considered explained, the question remains: what caused the entire country to observe strange craft in the skies? This episode has a strong connection to UFO Sweden and its enthusiasts. Many in the comments section made references to the ghost rockets, which a decade later would also prove to be highly visible light phenomenon in this area, attracted much attention by both public and stakeholders within ufology. As of yet, we haven't covered this mass sighting, but we are sorely tempted to do so in the future. In today's episode, we explore something called ghost flyers, a strange phenomenon reported in the early decades of the 20th century. These silent lights crossed remote skies, puzzling witnesses and leaving their origins a mystery. To uncover their secrets, we turn to key sources. UFO Information, Issue 2, 1979, along with research from Klaus Svan's blog and books, including UFO, The Close Encounters That Shook the World, and UFOs, Ghost Rockets, Light Globes, and Extraterrestrials. Between 1933 and 1934, the so-called ghost flyers caused a great stir in Scandinavia. Heavy snowstorms and thick fog did not deter these visitors, who were often described as flying light phenomena. The governments of the Nordic countries took the reports very seriously. In late November or early December of 1933, residents of Västerbotten, a county in Sweden near the Norwegian border and just below the Arctic Circle, began reporting sightings of unusual lights at night. These lights appeared to move along the valleys in the region, seeming to follow their contours, and were observed traveling in the direction of Norway. It is important to remember that in this remote region, the only aircraft typically seen were occasional customs and border patrol planes, along with a single emergency ambulance plane. At the time of the sightings, Border Patrol and Customs confirmed they had no planes in the air, and the ambulance plane was grounded for repairs. There were no nearby Air Force or military bases. Speculation arose that the lights might be linked to a smuggler, though the identity and cargo, presumed to be liquor, remained unclear. As a result, Customs planes began patrolling the area. Despite this, reports of strange, unidentified lights continued. In addition to sightings of what appeared to be airplane lights, residents reported strong searchlight beams originating from the sky, accompanied by mysterious aircraft sounds. By January 1934, hundreds of reports of ghost flyers had been recorded. These aircraft were observed flying in all types of weather, including conditions so severe that regular planes were grounded. No witnesses had seen the planes take off or land, leading to widespread speculation about their origins. Some speculated that the planes were operating from a secret base, possibly even from a covert aircraft carrier, as mysterious ships were also reported in the nearby waters during the ghost flyer incidents. In January 1934, a fighter squadron was stationed in Boden, tasked with searching for secret runways and hidden fuel depots in the wilderness, which proved a hopeless task. The Scandinavian air forces took the reports seriously, conducting repeated aerial sweeps of the region in search of unidentified aircraft. They also shared intelligence with each other and coordinated with local police, who investigated and documented each sighting. The reports poured in as densely as raindrops in a downpour, a Swedish newspaper wrote on January 8, 1934. And it was no exaggeration. On some days, over 100 reports came in about the mysterious aircraft's activity over northern Sweden. After a press release on April 30th, 1934, the Swedish military put a lid on the situation and refused to comment further on the sightings. Behind closed doors on April 28, 1934, General Pontus Reuterswärd drafted a 17-page secret memo to the Office of the Secretary of War that stated, "The collected and analyzed data has given me the impression that unauthorized air traffic has occurred. As a result, while a detailed record of these ghost flyer sightings exists, It's clear from the extensive material held at the Archives for UFO Research in Norrköping that this might not have been a true UFO wave, despite a few isolated reports. Instead, most of the events can with hindsight be attributed to misinterpretations, foreign aircraft violations, and widespread hysteria. Many were misled by the bright star Sirius and the planet Venus. Despite this, some aspects of the mystery of ghost flyers to this day remain unsolved. Many believe that the ghost flyer era was a local phenomenon specific to Scandinavia. This was not the case. Therefore, in UFO Information, 1979, issue number 2, investigators eagerly took an interest in a Canadian case from the same 1930s time period. This investigation was conducted by John Brent Musgrave, who went to the observation site in Canada more than 40 years after the fact. As recently as the mid-1930s, many of Canada's prairie provinces were still on the verge of colonization. Particularly in the northern areas, small farms had only just begun to open up the land for trade, and such luxuries as telephones, paved roads, and electric lights were still things of the future. The town of Nipawin in Saskatchewan is located in the northeastern part of the province, and in the 1930s, colonization had just begun. During the summer of 1933, Nipawin received reports that several farmers, as well as a forest ranger, had observed strange lights in the sky and near the ground. Whatever had been sighted had been seen for nearly a whole week. The land northwest of Nipawin, near the Tobin Lake area, consists of rolling hills and low-lying marshes. Parts of the area had only started to be cultivated a few years earlier, and much had yet to be done with the land. Due to the marshy terrain, most townspeople who heard about the strange lights dismissed them as swamp gas, a widely accepted explanation that continues to be referenced in similar sightings today. Fortunately, not everyone in the town was convinced that the stories were based on hot air or gases. And shortly after midnight on this summer day, 2 men and a woman jumped into a car and drove toward the area where the lights reportedly had been seen, determined to witness them for themselves. They were not disappointed, as a glow on the horizon occasionally grew brighter as they approached in the truck. After driving as close as the poor road allowed, they got out and continued on foot in the direction of the glow. They were stopped about 400 meters from the light source by a strip of marshland that was too soft to cross. But they were close enough. From their advantageous vantage point, they could now see that the light came from a large oval-shaped object, rounded on the top and slightly rounded on the bottom as well. It was equipped with legs, and from a centrally located door or hatch, about a dozen figures could be seen going up and down a staircase-like structure. The beings appeared to be slightly shorter than an average human, and were all dressed in what seemed to be silver-colored clothing or uniforms. They all wore helmets resembling ski caps, and all were busy repairing the craft, working at a very fast pace. All around, a strange silence prevailed, despite the fact that the figures were hurrying or running about. Not a single sound could be heard, and the 3 onlookers stared in silence, completely astonished by what was happening. None of them even thought to say anything. The bright orange light, which came from the machine, illuminated the surrounding area, and the 3 had no difficulty observing the activities. The light from the craft was not only bright, it had a kind of otherworldly quality that none of them had seen before, adding to the mystery of the scene. After about half an hour, they returned to the truck and set off toward the town, hoping to find a detour around the marsh so they could get a closer look of the strange machine, which stood parked in the middle of a marsh several kilometers from the nearest farm or forest lookout tower. When they finally found a shortcut, which might possibly get them closer, they realized they didn't have enough gasoline to get there and back. They had to return home that night. Not until a few nights later did they have the opportunity to return to the spot. It was a clear night, with almost a full moon, and they hoped they would be able to see even better. But that night, the object was gone, and not a trace of the shining craft could be seen from the place where it had stood 2 nights earlier. They returned to the truck to wait for dawn. In the morning, they went out to the bog to reach the spot where the object had been, and to see if there were any tracks. There were. 6 large square impressions, which must have been the feet on the legs that supported the craft, showed that an object had indeed stood there on the ground that night. Each impression was 60 to 75 centimeters square, spaced 2.4 to 3 meters apart. They were 5 to 7 centimeters deep. They also found the ground where the base of the staircase had rested. As if that wasn't remarkable enough, there was a large burned mark in the center of the area, covering a circle with an estimated diameter of 3.6 meters. They searched for footprints but found none, even though the vegetation where the craft had landed was slightly pressed down. They had come better prepared this time. One of them had brought a box camera and took photographs of the burn mark and the impressions. Later, two of them wrote an article about the whole event and sent it, along with the photographs, to some newspapers in Canada. But none of the newspapers were interested, and those that replied commented, "What kind of party were you at those nights?" Like many other UFO witnesses, these three soon learned to keep their experience to themselves. When John Brent Musgrave investigated the site more than 40 years after the event, he found that the original photographer had lost the images, likely owing to the fact that others had shown little interest in the case. Perhaps copies still exist, tucked away in an attic or wedged between vacation photos in an old photo album. If rediscovered, they may prove to be some of the earliest photographs of a case involving physical traces, where eyewitnesses observed a landing and beings emerging from the craft. Now, an additional 45 years have passed since Musgrave's investigation, yet the mystery remains equally baffling. As we consider the events surrounding the ghost flyers, it's interesting to draw a parallel to the origin of the term Foo Fighters. Like the ghost flyers, Foo Fighters was a label given to strange, unexplained aerial phenomena. During World War II, Allied pilots frequently reported strange glowing objects that followed their aircrafts. These baffling sightings were dubbed Foo Fighters, a name inspired by the comic strip Smokey Stover, where the character often exclaimed, "Where there's foo, there's fire." Much like the ghost flyer sightings over Scandinavia, these encounters left both witnesses and investigators searching for answers. Were the ghostly lights spectral horrors conjured by the mind of a fearful public? Or were they spy planes, or perhaps other phenomena, which fall within the range of scientific scrutiny? Or could something else be haunting our skies? Join our discussion, and if you like this content and wish to support the channel, feel free to leave a thumbs up. We stay in Sweden with an event from 1931. Unfortunately, there isn't much documentation about this case, but the high strangeness of the incident might clearly make up for that. When Jerk, yes, that is his real name, animated this episode, he hand-drew the small gnome-like beings on a drawing tablet in Photoshop. Often, we are assisted by artificial intelligence to speed up the animation process. But not in this case. Lisa was initially annoyed that the original illustrations weren't highlighted enough, but the case came together, thanks to Jerk's insistence, and ultimately, we are pretty fond of the overall impression. Welcome to this episode on Stories Lost. Happy to have you, new or old viewer, join us for another exploration into the annals of unexplained events. 100 years back, one icy winter in Sweden, a man in his early 30s was walking back home on a snow-covered road, lit by an effervescent moonlight. What he witnessed would come to haunt him for the next 30 years, and led him to be interviewed in UFO Sweden's magazine, UFO Information, issue number 2, 1962. As you will come to learn, there is no real solid evidence backing this case. Other than the man's testimony, no evidence of an encounter was ever collected. No scientific inquiry was conducted, and nothing warranted the retelling of events other than the visceral memory that lingered across decades. 100 years ago, there were no organizations such as UFO Sweden that could examine the case. It is from memory these events are recollected. A man's memory. A man who walked alone through the midwinter night and came upon humanoids that were starkly unfamiliar and exhibited odd behavior. We will leave it up to you, our viewers, to determine the reliability of this account. One evening shortly after New Year's in 1931, Helge Eriksson, who at the time of his interview was around 65 years old, had an experience that etched itself into his memory forever. At that time, he worked as a cattle herder on a farm just outside Eslöv. When the day's work was done, he went out to visit a friend at a nearby house. He stayed with him for a few hours, and it was on his way back in the late evening that Eriksson encountered something that you could say resides in that enigmatic borderland where human explanations and judgments fall short. I wasn't far from the farm where I worked when I saw 10 to 12 small men walking towards me. I spotted them from about 50 meters away, and they approached me at a quick pace. They were so small. Yes, they barely reached my knees, and I remember feeling scared out of my wits at the strange sight. The little men passed Eriksson at a mere few yards distance. He could observe them with utmost clarity, for an intense moonlight played over the snow and illuminated the farm road on which the small-statured figures approached him, barely knee-high. They came marching in step, single file, and spoke loudly to one another the entire time. Never had Eriksson heard such a language before. It sounded human, he emphasizes, but everything merged into a murmur, and he understood nothing of what was said. I became exceedingly fearful and had to truly steel myself to avoid fleeing from the spot. I found myself but a few yards distance from those little men. Therefore, I was able to count them. They were 10-12 in number. The evening was so bright that Eriksson could clearly make out the details of their appearance and attire. The little men were all bearded, and their heads seemed abnormally large in proportion to their bodies. I focused on their faces, which I thought appeared harsh and cruel in some way. They had dark complexions, and their beards seemed very long. The small beings were dressed in dark clothing. He got the impression of dark green, and wore hoods on their heads. The hoods were the same color as the rest of their attire, and it appeared as if everything was fashioned from a single piece of fabric, perhaps as some sort of blouse they had pulled over themselves, he remarked. Eriksson had a feeling that the little men saw him as well, but they paid no attention to his presence. They walked in a line, one after the other, stomping so loudly that he had never heard the like. It was just as if a military troop had come marching. The ground was frozen hard, making the sound even more distinct. Despite their quick and rhythmic movement, Eriksson noted that they walked smoothly and lightly. But he also noticed a peculiar smell emanating from the little men. It was a strong, acrid odor, perhaps something chemical. The men, who by Eriksson's estimation must have been less than a meter in height, passed swiftly by him without taking any notice of his presence. At the tree-lined avenue leading up to the farm where he worked, a large field began, and the men or creatures went straight out onto it. There, Eriksson beheld a strange blue-violet glow in the distance. About half a minute after the strangers had passed by Eriksson, they reached the glow, which was surrounded by what Eriksson could only describe as a mist. What this was, I do not know, continues Eriksson. It was just like some sort of mist around a splotch-like mass, from which a blue-violet glow emanated. They vanished into that glow, disappearing in an instant, as if carried away by a machine. I heard only a whirring in the air, and then they were gone. The light was extremely bright, with variations in yellow, blue, and violet. It was a light of an intensity that he had never before seen, at least not here on Earth, Eriksson remembered. Eriksson tells UFO Information that he has mulled these things over and over during the years that have passed, ever since that bright January evening in 1931. He has also spoken of the event to a lot of people. Some believe him, others do not, but he remains quite indifferent to their reactions, steadfast in his conviction that what he saw, he saw. Everything remains clear and distinct to him, and he does not forget the terror he experienced during that strange encounter on the road. When he came home that evening and had laid down for the night, he could not sleep. The incredulous experience replayed over and over in his mind, and ever since he has constantly had to convince himself of what his senses registered. I met them personally. I heard their footsteps, saw their eyes and faces, smelled the odor, and all the rest. I saw them. I have never experienced anything like it since, and when it happened, I was fully clear-headed. I am in control of myself, and I always have been. There is a pause before Eriksson continues. Nah, they weren't no regular folks I met, he says with conviction. I thought straight away these must be folks from another world. This was the account of Helga Eriksson. What intelligence could we glean from how he portrays these events and himself? There's a long list of strange facts. Knee-high half men walking in step, chatting loudly in phonics audible but not intelligible to the human ear. Cold and cruel demeanor, nonchalantly passing Helgi as he stood half-frozen in terror. A vessel shrouded in mist and colorful lights, without any apparent entry point. A vessel that disappears almost instantaneously. It would be easy to dismiss it all as a false memory or a tall tale. Helgi claims he was in control of his senses and gives himself no out in terms of alternate explanations, such as inebriation or fatigue. He is sure of what he saw. Almost 100 years after that moonlit night, what do we think and how do we feel about his testimony? This case clearly shows how strange events can leave a lasting impact. The fact that the boys share the same memory, despite not discussing it with each other for so many years, makes the whole story even stranger. This case is a personal favorite. As twin brothers, we can relate to that type of wordless communication. When we were preparing the manuscript, we were discussing what exactly was it that made this case stand out. What made it such an endurable classic in Swedish UFO lore? Then we decided that it was this discomfort, this feeling of unease, of knowing something to be out of place, out of gear, that ultimately makes you tuck that secret away. Welcome to another episode of Stories Lost. In this episode, we're going to a place near Hamleden, where Shell and Kurt had their sightings that we covered in our episode published on May 24, 2024. The place we're now visiting is only 20 kilometers away from Hamleden and is a small village called Byviken, beautifully situated by the lake Trehörningsjö. Let's take a closer look at an incident that occurred there in the summer of 1949 and ask ourselves, what devilry emerged in Byviken? Have you ever entertained the idea that just beneath the surface lies another world? In childhood, the touch of that barrier can be experienced as paper thin. Searching for the proof of something behind the veil, you come up short, bewildered, but still a feeling sticks, a viscous film clinging to the back of your tongue. Imagine a pristine summer day, the green that tickles underfoot, the breeze that seems immaculate, the crowns of trees under the blue heaven's goodness. Imagine that just underneath there is yet another force of ruin and decay that accompanies everything. Exactly that feeling lingered with two brothers during decades. The disturbance of a good day, a day that began in tranquility, in the lulling ease of summer but then stirred into action, shed its scales and revealed a waking nightmare. This episode on Stories Lost delves into that feeling, an experience eerily close to a script by David Lynch. But far from make-believe, these events did take place and did leave a lingering feeling of malaise. When they were 8 years old, the twin brothers Holger and Henry experienced a very strange event at their home in Byviken. The event was so strange that even as adults they felt a certain discomfort talking about it. Both of them could also, under certain circumstances, feel strange pangs of discomfort caused by the experience, which was forever engraved in their minds. This is yet another example of how the most beautiful conditions in a place associated with childhood security quickly can turn into a haunting experience, triggering feelings of fear even in adulthood. This strange event was reported on in UFO Sweden's magazine UFO Information issue number 3 in 1978. Erland Sandqvist accounts for his interview with the twins. Erland writes in the article that he got to hear the story from an acquaintance of his. He got very interested, and his acquaintance set up a meeting between Erland and the brothers. The meeting took place on December 18th, 1977, at Holger's home. After the customary small talk and chit-chat, the brothers began to tell their story that took place approximately 30 years earlier. The brothers told their story with sincerity and a bit of humor, but also with a great deal of seriousness. It was apparent that their experience affected them both deeply. Erland notes in the article that although their story is the strangest and most unreal observation he has ever heard of, it's also the most believable story he has ever heard. The way they told the story and the circumstances surrounding it showed that they were not bluffing or in any way making it up. Their factual account of their observations did not leave any room for misinterpretation of something mundane as the cause of their sighting. The brothers weren't afraid to share the story with the public, even though they realized it could portray them as lunatics. They thought it was a good idea to tell the story to a magazine specialized on such events, as they figured its readers would find it fascinating. The mainstream media, on the other hand, would perhaps find it too bizarre to even publish, as its readers wouldn't be susceptible to it. The brothers also stressed the fact that there must be more people that have encountered strange sightings, and that coming forward with their story could encourage others to share theirs in a similar way. They also added that it would be nice if they knew there were others who had experienced something similarly amazing, but real. At the same time, they say that it doesn't matter what other people think of their story. They know what they've seen, and nothing can make them doubt that. It's time to let the brothers tell their story that made both a physical and psychological impact. Holger says that it was a sunny and warm summer morning in June or perhaps July 1949. It was a beautiful morning, not a cloud in the sky and no wind. Even though it is many years ago, I remember it as it was yesterday. Our dad was at work, but our mother was at home. We were both sitting on the porch when I first observed the phenomenon. To begin with, I thought it looked like a big bulk that moved in the air close to a hill nearby, much like a large, heavy piece of timber. It slowly moved over the farm fields and must have been about 600 meters away when I first spotted it. I was under the impression that the bulk emerged from the mountain itself, which I feel would be really strange. But I know I saw it with the hill as a clear backdrop. The bulk moved in walking speed. It flew about 10 meters over the ground and never changed its altitude. It came from the north and traveled south with no apparent changing in direction. I remember that I heard a strange sound coming from it, a sound I have trouble describing. I have never heard such a sound either before or later. It was a persistent sound with a certain vibration. Maybe you could compare the noise to the sound of air blowing in some way. Holger's brother Henry says that he also remembers the sound. It was a whistling sound, like air being forced through something. But it's still not a good enough comparison. Some years ago, I had a watch that made a faint metallic ticking noise that reminded me of the sound I heard that day. The vibrating sound from the watch was so unpleasant because it reminded me of the object we saw as children, so I got a new watch. When Henry tells this to Erland, Holger exclaims that it's unbelievable because he had the same problem with a watch, making that unpleasant sound. Henry says that he didn't see the object until it passed over some pines about 30 meters from them. The pines swayed, but he's not sure if that was caused by the object. That was when I heard that eerie sound. When the bulk came close, we soon saw that it didn't look like a bulk at all. Instead, it was a very thick frame with beams crossing. The frame and the beams looked like they were made of iron and about 30-40 centimeters thick. The thing looked like a driveway drag. A driveway drag is a tool used to make gravel or dirt driveways smooth and even. It looks like a heavy metal frame with bars that drag along the ground to break up clumps and spread the material evenly. Its color was brown-black. It looked dirty and must have been at least 4 meters wide and 8 meters long, the brothers claimed. 2 beams crossed the 2 longer beams in the frame, where some sort of yellow projectiles were attached. There were about 4 to 5 of them, and they glowed like heated, melted metal. Henry said that he had a vague memory of seeing a rotating shadow above the frame when looking straight up from beneath it. I must have seen it through the center of the frame, like when looking up at a rotating blade on a helicopter, he says. When the object was directly above the brothers, they say that one of the glowing projectiles was released. It was the one that was positioned farthest out on the left edge of the frame. It slowly tumbled to the ground, like when dropping a balloon. When it detached from the frame, it did so in a sequential way. First, its pointy end turned downwards towards the ground, then it started falling. It was like it was rolling downwards. It was bigger than a soccer ball and had an oblong shape. It crashed into the ground only 3 decimeters from Holger's left leg. It hit the cement plate at the bottom of the porch. In that same moment, it exploded. But there was no sound, no bang, only a sharp flash of light. It was like a fireball that shattered into small bullets that then scattered around. It looked like they floated around and then dissolved in a way that resembled the behavior of liquid oxygen. In the explosion, the cement plate was cracked, and it felt like someone threw a fistful of sand at their legs, says Holger. The cement plate was 30 centimeters thick and rested on a layer of sand. Now one of its corners was damaged, and the plate had a bow-shaped crack in it. The object continued to glide towards their house without changing speed, altitude, or direction, and made no sound. They had both been sitting still and watching the object without saying anything to each other. We didn't even move when the projectile fell down, not even when it exploded. As soon as the object had passed over the roof, we got up and ran around the corner of the house. But then it was gone. We couldn't see it anywhere, despite the weather being clear and that we had a good view of the surrounding area from our house. We went back to the porch, and just when we got there, our mom came running out of the house with our old Dux radio that apparently was burning. There was a lot of smoke coming from it, and the bakelite was cracked. It was a battery radio, so it was never plugged to the wall. The incident with the radio became the big happening of that day and overshadowed the boys' encounter that really wasn't discussed with the parents. The parents thought there had been a lightning strike that caused both the radio burning and the crack in the cement plate. The father even got insurance money for the radio being destroyed by lightning. If it was a lightning strike, it was hard to explain why the bolt made no sound, and also how the sky was clear. In retrospect, they think it's strange that they never talked to anyone about what they had seen, not even with each other. It wasn't until 15 years later, when they met in a town in the middle part of Sweden, that they started talking about it. Holger said that it must have been in 1964, when they for some reason talked about the subject. He had said to his brother, "Do you remember that thing that came flying over the house when we were sitting on our porch at our home in Byviken?" Henry responded that he did remember this and got the bright idea that before they talked any more about it, they would go into separate rooms, draw the object, and then compare the drawings. Their drawings were almost identical. Only a few details differed, said Holger's wife, who was there and saw the drawings. When the brothers were interviewed by Erland for UFO information, they both felt unpleasant talking about it. They both even avoided looking at the place where they first had seen the object. Holger said that there is one view of the mountain that would bring strong feelings of unpleasantness if he would try to look in that direction from the old porch. Holger said that he was sure he wouldn't be able to look in that direction. "I have a feeling that if I would look in that direction again, that thing would come again, and I would start crying." "Strange, but that's what I feel," he said. Henry felt the same way, but for him it was the pine trees that he couldn't look at. Holger adds that now when he thinks about it, even in adulthood, he has avoided that part of the hill when skiing in the area or picking berries. Erland returned to Holger 4 weeks after the interview to double-check some facts. Holger told Erland that he, for days after their interview, had experienced an unpleasant feeling in his body, and that it was as if something told him that it was wrong of him to talk about the observation. He felt like he had done something very wrong, and felt a great sense of shame over it. During this visit, Erland also got to meet the brothers' parents that now were in their 70s. Their mother remembered that day when the radio caught fire. She told Erland about her experience from that day. "I was down at the milk pallet beside the road when I heard a loud bang. My first thought was that a lightning strike must have occurred, and I ran to the house and went inside to the kitchen where the radio was burning. I threw the radio out of the house and grabbed a bucket of water and ran up to the attic where some cables were smoking. I feared that the entire house was going to burn to the ground. I splashed water on the cables until they stopped smoking. It was almost as if something told me to go up to the attic." When Erland made this second visit, one of the brothers had just some days earlier told his parents about what he and his brother had seen that day. The mother remembered that she wondered how that thick cement plate in front of the porch had got its crack. I guess the lightning had caused it. But it was strange, because there was no thunder that beautiful summer morning. It must have been lightning out of a clear sky, she posits. Erland writes in his article that it seems strange that the mother claims to have heard a loud bang, but then the boys claim to not have heard any noise. The house was rebuilt some years after the observation, and was moved a short distance from its earlier location. None of the brothers could think of standing at the location where the porch had been, and looking in the direction of where they saw the object. On the other hand, they both said they would have no problem looking in that direction from another point of view, or if they stood there on a rainy day. But they would never stand there on a sunny summer day, looking at the hill or the pines. So, what do we take away from these events? As David Lynch remarks, if we look a little closer at this beautiful world, there are always red ants underneath. Well, how brittle is the veil that separates the unthinkable, the twisted, from the ordinary and comfortable day-to-day? When is it possible for the world as we know it to turn into the logic of dreams, distorted and nightmarish? Is it when man chooses it, or when the world turns itself upside down, inside out? For two brothers, the nightmare became real. It stayed with them as a nightmare that kept haunting them, pushing through the cracks of the beautiful. No longer could they watch the skyline or roam their childhood forests in the same way, not without a sense of dread and a boding. In their mind, the world beyond is palpable in a radical way. Here's another case where the evidence is weak, but the story is so peculiar that it makes me think twice about the boy's experience. In The Boy with the Extraterrestrials, all the aliens were hand-drawn by Jerk. He was later a bit upset when John added heavy black and white filters to them and even accused his brother of being afraid of colors. It's not always sunshine and rainbows on this channel. The story in this week's episode is interesting from a number of different perspectives, but not because it provides a lot of evidence for extraterrestrial contact. No, the evidence in this story is rather thin. So what makes this story worth telling? Well, let me explain, despite the fact that it is just an old man's memories of strange events that he experienced as an 8-year-old boy during some summers in the 1950s, and that the only person who has been able to verify certain things in his story is his own mother. Representatives of the notoriously serious organization UFO Sweden, which he contacted in 2015, found him so credible that they decided to do quite extensive field investigations. Being perceived as credible does not mean that something is true, but it does raise questions that even the most ardent skeptic should consider. The people who had the opportunity to hear the man talk about what happened to him were convinced that he was not lying, and they were able to confirm several details with his elderly mother. They concluded that he was simply telling them what he remembered, which again does not mean that what he remembered actually happened. Either he made it all up for some unclear motive, perhaps attention, in which case he also implicated his mother, or he was suffering from a temporary delusion, or he had created false memories for some reason, which again would mean that he persuaded his mother to vouch for the authenticity of his stories. Then, of course, there is the possibility that what he claims happened did happen. Yes, this story is interesting from several perspectives, but anyone expecting proof will be disappointed. But that is why this channel exists, to tell things that would not otherwise be told. And as always, it is entirely up to you to decide what you believe to be true or not. In the late 1950s, Bo Hallberg was 8 years old. One summer morning he walked down to the lake, which was about 100 meters from his house. He walked through the cow pasture next to the family farm and heard what he describes as metal tapping coming from further down the pasture, closer to the lake. Like most children, Bo was a curious boy and wanted to investigate where the sound was coming from. He thought the whole thing was strange because there were never any people at that part of the lake. He passed through a small grove of trees in the pasture and came out into a more open area. At the bottom of a slope by a heap of stones at the far end of the field, he saw something strange. Bo says it looked like a giant hubcap lying there. The saucer-shaped object had a dome on both the top and bottom. He soon realized that it was not only the object that was strange. Bo says, "I ducked a little, and then I saw that there were some strange people there. One was standing by the heap of stones, and another was doing something in the heap. Next to them, there were 4 more figures who instead were cutting some bushes. I thought they looked strange because they were quite small with pointy heads. They were people who were much shorter than we are and didn't look like us either." Bo's curiosity grew. He took a few steps closer, and one of the figures saw him. The figure quickly held up one hand in front of him and gestured a stop sign. Despite this, Bo continued to take a few more steps towards the figure, who then took an instrument from his belt at his waist and aimed it. Shortly afterwards, some kind of projectile was fired at him. It hit me in the stomach on the right side. It was some kind of arrow, so I pulled it out and threw it to the side, and then I collapsed. Bo has vague memories of what happened next. He remembers that 3 figures came walking towards him. They seemed to be looking for the projectile, and then lifted him up and carried him into the craft. There, he was placed on some kind of cot, and what he remembers is that he was carried out again and placed where they had first picked him up. Suddenly, the craft turned on its side and flew out over the lake and disappeared with a loud bang. Shortly afterwards, a similar craft came and made the same maneuver over the lake. Bo also noticed that the craft left a burn mark in the grass where it had been standing. A dazed Bo went home and showed his mother his shirt, which was torn and bloody where the projectile had hit him. Soon Bo was telling his mother about what he had experienced, who also followed him outside to look at the grass, which was burnt in a circular shape. On another occasion, he was at a barn on a neighboring farm when a saucer landed. He became frightened and hid in the barn. Soon he saw a female figure standing outside the saucer, but when he heard the figure say that there was nothing to be afraid of, he left his hiding place. She looked much like a human, but shorter and dressed in a leather uniform with a belt and an emblem on her left breast. The woman told him that she could converse in Swedish, but that it would sound a bit strange. She introduced herself by name and told him about her home planet, but these are details that Bo says he no longer remembers. The woman asked Bo if he had any berry bushes. He started walking towards his neighbor's house to show her one. When she followed him, he noticed that she did not walk as humans, but hovered with her feet slightly above the ground. They then started walking towards the place where the craft had stood when Bo first met the aliens. She told him that on that occasion, the craft had flown into a spruce tree and had landed to carry out repairs. Bo says that he met the same woman on 3 occasions that summer and that they walked around for hours talking, but that his memories of these encounters are rather vague. The following summer, the meetings with the female continued. On one occasion, when they passed the potato field, the woman asked if she could take potatoes. Bo said yes. Shortly thereafter, his stepfather became very upset when he saw an oblong pointed footprint in the potato field. Bo tells of another occasion when the craft had once again landed in the pasture at his parents' home, and when the craft was about to take off, he was asked to step back and keep his arms and head down. Bo says he became paralyzed as the craft rose and could not move his head until it left. He also saw that his boots had been burned, and his mother threw them away so that his stepfather would not see them. After this time, there were also 4 prints in the grass from some kind of landing gear. The woman had later asked Bo to cover these tracks by dragging a shovel behind him. Before the woman left this time, she said that the time a craft had crashed into a spruce tree, the crew had hidden parts of the craft in the heap of rocks next to it. The woman gave Bo the task of retrieving these and burying them. He did as she said, but intentionally left one of the pieces under the rocks. The woman had also given him an instrument that looked like a pen so that he could communicate with her. He first hid the instrument in one of the barns, but later threw it into a well because he was afraid of it. Bo's contact with the aliens ended after he was told to go to an area with power lines. He was told to come by himself. However, he took a friend with him and no aliens showed up. When the Swedish UFO organization spoke to Bo's mother, she confirmed the burnt boots, the burnt circle in the grass, the bloody shirt, and that Bo at the time had told her about his encounters with aliens. The same organization has conducted searches where Bo says he dug and hid parts of the craft and the rubble in which the aliens first had placed them, with no results. Finally, Bo said that he had been asked if he wanted to accompany the woman to her home planet, as he would be better off there, but he had declined. It is of course impossible to confirm or deny Bo's stories with any certainty. Were they a little boy's escape from reality? Or did he meet aliens there in the Swedish summer idyll sometime in the late 1950s? We continue into the 1950s, but cross the border into Norway, and the very strange encounter 2 women had while picking blueberries. Beyond being an extraordinary story in itself, it also sheds light on the stigmatization that those who claim to have experienced strange phenomena often face from society. When Jerk animated this episode, he reached out to a Norwegian singer-songwriter who had composed a song about this very incident. We were unfortunately not able to get her permission to use it in our episode, but we played it, listened to it, and were inspired to pick up on a few of the themes in the song as we finalized the production. Welcome viewers to another episode on Stories Lost. In this episode, we explore an interesting report from the north of Norway. Two berry pickers find something other than blueberries in the low-lying shrubs. What starts as a chance encounter will later end in heartache. People to this day ask themselves, was it fabrication? Was it a prank pulled by American soldiers? Or was it something that we are yet to understand? We who follow this issue know that the aftermath of unexplained observations often can have long-term implications. The emotional and physical consequences of intense scrutiny and public ridicule are sometimes a price that witnesses are forced to pay, and keep paying, simply because their reported experience reached the ears of others. Reasonably, skepticism does not necessarily need to lead to scorn and bullying. Questions are key to understanding an issue. There is a Chinese proverb that states, "He who asks a question is a fool for a minute, but he who does not remains a fool forever." That begs the question, how should we go about asking questions that show adequate respect for the inquiry, as well as the people queried? This episode takes us to the north of Norway, in the 1950s. The reported events take place at Øyfjellet, a mountain located in the Vefsn municipality of Nordland County. The landscape around Øyfjellet is characterized by dramatic cliffs, steep slopes, and lush green valleys. At the base of this beautiful Norwegian mountain lies the picturesque town of Mosjøen, where, at this point in time, two sisters lived. Two sisters who, unexpectedly, were drawn into a strange story. But was the fault their own? That which later hit them like a ton of bricks, was it all originally of their own volition? Were these two ordinary girls attention seekers? Or were they just too open, too honest about an experience that no one could make sense of? This Friday morning in 1954, the sisters Edith Jacobsen, 24, and Asta Solvang, 32, were on a berry-picking trip with their uncle, Halvdan Jacobsen, on Øyfjellet. There were scarcely any berries to be found, and eventually the two sisters wandered off alone in the terrain. How far away the uncle was is difficult to say. Eventually, the sisters agreed to explore a nearby bog to see if there might be more berries to pick there. In the two newspapers, Nordaland's Folkblad and Helgeland's newspaper from August 1954, the younger sister Edith talks about her experience. Suddenly, we saw a man approaching us from a distance. At first, we thought he must be another berry picker, but when he came towards us, we saw that he wasn't carrying anything with which he could collect the berries. We went to meet him while wondering what kind of stranger had made his way out to these parts. Then he smiled and extended his hand to greet us. I smiled back and was about to shake his hand, but he just quickly brushed his hand against the inside of mine. He started talking, but we didn't understand a word he said. It didn't resemble any language I've heard. I have learned a bit of German and English, am working on a lingophone course in Spanish, and have heard some French and Russian on the radio. This language, on the other hand, was very soft and melodic. It seemed to have few consonants and no coughing or spitting sounds at all. It flowed like a continuous stream and was not divided into words. When we realized that the man must be from a distant country, we began to look at him more closely. He was of medium height, had regular, handsome facial features, dark long hair with a natural wave. His complexion was nicely suntanned. We didn't notice the color of his eyes, but I think they were slightly slanted. His hands were beautiful and expressive, with long, fine fingers, like what I imagine a master pianist must have. He wore no rings. He wore something that looked like a jumpsuit, but he had a wide belt around his waist, so it could have been pants and a blouse. The blouse closed tightly at the neck, but was otherwise quite loose. I couldn't see any buttons or zippers or anything similar. The color was khaki brown. We didn't notice his shoes. There was always something calm and trustworthy about him. I didn't feel the least bit nervous or afraid of the man. When it was clear that we didn't understand him and he didn't understand us, he took out something to draw with. It wasn't paper, at least not what we mean by paper. It looked like some kind of grayish pocket mirror, and he took it out of a pocket. Then he drew on it with something that might have resembled a pencil. I didn't notice it closely. He drew some circles. Then he raised both arms out towards the bog, then pointed at us, and then at one of the circles. After that, he pointed at himself and at another circle. I immediately had the impression that he wanted to tell us something about the solar system, but it's very possible that I was wrong. I don't know if the circles were meant to be planets. The man made a hand gesture indicating that we should follow him. Then he turned and walked across the bog. We trudged after him, and a short distance further, we saw a strange object. It was gray-blue and looked like two enormous pot lids placed against each other. But honestly, I don't know how to describe the color. It appeared mostly blue-gray, but that doesn't mean I've seen a similar color before. The diameter could have been about 3 meters, and it was 1.5 meters high. Because the man was still so calm and convincingly friendly, we still weren't afraid. But we did think it was a somewhat strange find here in the middle of the wilderness. We walked up to the object, but he gestured that we shouldn't come too close. He certainly couldn't stand upright in it, but probably had to sit. When we reached the object so that we could see it, the man nodded and smiled at us. Then he opened a sort of hatch on the top edge of the brim that ran around the middle of the object. The hatch went up and slightly forward. He crawled inside, feet first, and closed the hatch behind him. The last we saw of him was him waving and smiling at us. The object began to hum faintly, like a large bumblebee, and the strange craft slowly lifted while rotating around its own axis. Only then did it occur to me everything I had read and heard about flying saucers. When the craft had risen 20-30 meters, it hovered in the air for a moment, then began to rotate very quickly, and with tremendous speed, it shot straight upwards. Soon we couldn't follow it with our eyes anymore. The newspapers have since called it a flying saucer, but I want to say that I have never used that word when I've talked about the episode to anyone. Asta and I agreed that we wouldn't tell anyone about what we had seen. Now that the man and his craft were gone, and we were left with our berry baskets without the slightest bit of evidence, it all seemed so unbelievable and fantastic that we were afraid of being laughed at if we said anything. We met our uncle a little later, and I don't understand how he didn't notice anything unusual about us. For my part, I walked around in a daze and felt like I was talking nonsense while thinking about what had happened. It was Asta who told it first. She couldn't keep it hidden from her husband, and then it spread throughout the whole town. A journalist from Nordlands Folkeblad heard about it and alerted the police to get the story confirmed. We were questioned by the police, and on Thursday, we were taken up to Oidalen for an on-site inspection. There were no traces, but that wasn't expected either, as 6 days had passed since it happened. Since the story became known, we have been overwhelmed from all sides. We've received lots of letters from individuals and organizations that investigate flying saucers. We couldn't go into town without being stopped and having to retell everything. Many people laugh at us, and many are angry because they believe we are trying to make fools of the whole town. But we have only told what we saw and heard as best as we can remember it. We saw it at the same time and perceived it the same way. But the pressure on us has been so great that sometimes I start to wonder if I've gone crazy. It's so fantastic that I can well understand why even people who have known me my whole life refuse to believe me. People can believe what they want, but I sincerely wish that someone else had had this experience in Oidalen. A priest, or a police chief, or other serious, respected men whom people would believe. This was how Esther described the strange event. Alongside her account, the press recorded a plethora of opinions that spread throughout the local community. Machinist Halvdan Jakobsen, the sister's uncle, who was on the berry-picking trip, was utterly exasperated when interviewed by investigators. He said, "I never dreamed that such a fuss would be made over a poor blueberry-picking trip. Because I am the uncle of Asta and Edith, I have found myself in a tricky situation. I don't want to accuse them of lying, but one thing is certain. No such craft as the one the girls describe took off from the blueberry woods that day. I was never more than 3 to 4 minutes away and would have had to see or hear something. No, those flying saucers, they exist in only one place, inside people's heads. Most people will just laugh at such stories, but that's not right. It's dangerous that people have gotten these things into their heads. We hear about it from all corners of the world. It's a weapon in the Cold War that creates uncertainty and fear of war." The sister's mother, Mrs. Jacobson, was of a different opinion. "I have to believe that my daughters are telling the truth and that they really saw what they say. It is terribly strange, but there are so many strange things in this world That the man should be from another planet seems too incredible to me, but I don't know much about such matters. I would have just dismissed the whole thing if it weren't for the fact that I know my daughters. Arvid Øye and John Brechen from the Highway Department stated that they believed the sisters in question. We believe what has been said. People shouldn't be afraid to believe in something unusual. We know the ladies. They are mature and credible. We have no opinion on where this man came from, but isn't it reasonable enough that people from other planets might have come as far as or further than us? Mayor Anderson, the local mayor of Mosjøen, expressed his disbelief. No, I can't bring myself to believe this. It's unbelievable how this story has come about because the two ladies are known to be sensible and credible. I would rather Mosjøen be known for other things, such as the great sports facility we have, or the pleasant villa area. Local boat builder Mikael Mjaland told investigators at the time, I don't want to get involved in such things. I know a lot about boats after 60 years as a boat builder, but I don't know anything about what flies in the air. Maybe there are such things as flying saucers in America and other countries, but here in Vefsn? No way. The worst we have here is the Trangskaringen, the southwest squall through Trangskaret. This powerful wind can be quite destructive. It has overturned my boathouse twice. Gunhild Christiansen, a local resident whom investigators met at the harbor quay in Mosjøen, stated, I don't know if the ladies imagined they saw something or if they deliberately concocted the whole story, but nonsense is what it is anyway. Can sensible people take such a story seriously? Evidently, there were mixed opinions among the local community. The newspapers were also full of more or less accurately reported stories these days. Not only in Norway, but also in Europe and especially in the USA, there was an incredible interest in this case. In Helgeland's newspaper on Saturday, August 28, 1954, one of the sisters is interviewed, without being named, but UFO Norway believe it might be the youngest, Edith. In the article, it is clear that the attention the story has attracted has detrimentally affected the sisters. Exasperated, Edith exclaims, What can I say? I think it's unfortunate that we have ended up in such a situation, and we haven't had any peace from phone calls and inquiries from both home and abroad. It's unfortunate, but we have only told the truth. A bright spot, however, is a letter we received from a woman. It was posted in jar. She tells us that she once saw something similar. She describes it as a flying saucer up close, but when she told people about it, she was just laughed at. She tells us that she understands very well how difficult it must be for us right now, and tries to comfort us as best she can. The letter gives the impression that she is a good and wise woman, and we were sincerely happy to receive it. The article in Helgeland on August 28, 1954, concludes, It has deeply affected the ladies that their story is being so strongly doubted. The sisters have the very best reputation among people, and until this story came up, no one who knows them would have dared to suspect them of dishonesty of any kind. According to what we have been informed, Mrs. Solvang has once again assured police officer Stephen Stevenson that she and her sister have spoken the truth from beginning to end, and during the last conversation, the lady burst into tears because she felt as though people did not believe her. At the same time, a fact has come to light that might strengthen the wife's statements. It turns out that the wife's husband talked about the incident to his colleagues at work the day before the story was published, and he told his colleagues that his wife had behaved very strangely upon returning from the trip. She was agitated and lay awake all night without being able to sleep, and he felt convinced that she had experienced something that had made a strong impression on her. When she finally told him about the encounter with the saucer, the husband said to her, "But this is nonsense. I can't tell anyone about this." Asta replied that it was entirely true, and that he was free to tell anyone he liked, which he did, and this is largely why the story became public. Now, it might be argued that the husband was also in on the joke, but people who know him say it is completely unthinkable that he would have done something like that. The editor of Helgeland, B. Bjerkmo, took such an interest in the case that he covered it in the editorial on Saturday, August 28, 1954. He wrote, "The saucer affair from Ufjellet is now starting to take the form of a comedy or tragedy. It depends on the point of view. We have before us two adult women who are considered to be credible and equipped with normal intelligence. They are 24 and 32 years old, respectively. The older one is married. They are mentally sound and balanced, dutiful, and generally respected by all who know them. The two ladies tell the police that they have seen a flying saucer and greeted its pilot. Are these ladies out for fun? If so, the prank has resulted in the ladies having to go into hiding, the police considering charging them with giving false testimony. The result has been weeping and gnashing of teeth. But then it is no longer fun. The ladies must expect to be subjected to people's gloating smiles for a long time to come, and then it has developed into a tragedy. It can certainly be argued that it is self-inflicted, but it is still a tragedy. And then we have, after all, the possibility that the ladies are telling the truth, and it can be said that there are indeed some in Mojuan who believe them. But the vast majority do not place the slightest trust in the sisters' explanation. An American helicopter pilot has come forward to refute the possibility that it could have been him they talked to. Local police officers assure us that there is not the slightest trace of a saucer on Ufjelle, and a relative of the ladies who was with them on the berry-picking trip claims that he was never more than 100 meters away from them. Clearly, this indicates that the episode could not have taken place. So many circumstances speak against the possibility that the ladies could have told the truth, but they still might have. The two ladies tell the police that they have seen a flying saucer and greeted its pilot. Then the tragedy becomes significant. For our part, we honestly don't know what to believe anymore. We are inclined, just like the majority, to doubt the story. It is so difficult to do otherwise. But on the other hand, we cannot quite bring ourselves to join in the laughter. The sisters stand by their explanation. If it is true that they are telling the truth, then they have found themselves in the most desperate situation imaginable. As long as they do not tell anything different, or it is established beyond any doubt that their story is pure fabrication, we choose to leave the matter as an open question. The saucer affair has now developed to the point where two women are sitting on the defendant's bench. But according to good legal practice, all doubt should benefit the accused. That will be our position going forward. But who was this American soldier that editor Björkmo mentions in his editorial? An article from an American newspaper, taken from the Times-Picayune, New Orleans, August 29, 1954, sheds some well-needed light on the matter. On August 28th, the Associated Press was on the scene and reported the following surprising briefing from Stuttgart, Germany. A helicopter pilot from the United States Army said Friday that it was not him who scared two Norwegian women into thinking they had seen a saucer pilot. And he doesn't look anything like the man the women said they saw. Sergeant Billy C. Foro, 29, from Council Bluffs, Iowa, was one of several pilots conducting a secret exercise in Norway last week. Reports from Oslo said that two women picking berries were surprised by a dark-skinned, long-haired man who tried to talk to them. Then he disappeared into a strange vessel that looked like two soup plates. Rumors circulated in Oslo that it could have been American pilots playing a prank. Foro, the first of the pilots to return, said, "The only thing I know about the women is what I have read in the newspapers." Journalists note that Billy is a striking opposite, with short hair, and is 1.78 meters tall and weighs 68 kilos. The United States Army would not comment on the matter, as the trip was classified. In 1994, when 40 years had passed, both sisters are alive and well. At this point in time, UFO Norway was in contact with the older sister, Åsta Solvang. The older sister tells investigators, with a mix of bitterness and frustration, "We have been made to look like fools. It has been written about us in all the newspapers, saying we were just making things up. So, we are not interested in having more published about us." Åsta also mentions that she has not been able to put the episode behind her during these 40 years. Apart from a period of insomnia, which might not have been so unnatural after all the commotion, Åsta experienced a 6-month bout of eczema that covered her entire body. This condition began the same year as the incident. The eczema oozed, spread across her skin, and caused severe itching. This could be a result of psychological stress following the experience in all the writings. When asked if they still stood by what they said back then, she replied, "I couldn't possibly say something like that if it wasn't true." She also mentioned that she hadn't bothered to read either UFO books or any other UFO literature afterward, except for newspaper and magazine coverage of their own story. which caused her frustration. Not even Adamski's book, which, after all, contained many parallels. The investigator deemed her sincere, and later wrote that he found absolutely no reason to doubt her account. He confessed that he was tempted to consider the event as something on the borderline of the physical world. This explanation would account for why her uncle, who was so close, didn't experience anything at all. We move forward in time, another 30 years. It's autumn 2024, and the blueberry forest on the mountain of Oyfjellay bears fruit once more. Rubber boots compress the purple heather flowers, ignorant of the surprising encounter that caused such a commotion 90 years prior. The trees stand as silent witnesses to the creatures that scratch at the earth's surface. They neither smirk nor ask questions. The trees look up and down in equal measure, just as complicit with daydreams copied from books, military pranks on civilians, and even actual interdimensional travelers. Can we ask question like trees? Solemn, accepting and open to the unexpected answers. A fool only for a minute. The event in the next episode is said to have occurred in Sweden, the year after the Norwegian blueberry forest encounter. While we only have a second-hand source to rely on, this case might be the one that has moved me the most. Even if it's all made up, there's something deeply sad about the idea of an alien dying alone on a distant planet. A lot of our fans tell us that this is their favorite episode. Maybe you think so too. Welcome to another episode of Stories Lost. Also in this episode, we stay in the Nordic countries, as I found an old Norwegian article from the magazine UFO #2 from 1988 that I think should be available to more people. The story begins in an art gallery in Copenhagen in 1977. In an exhibition called Love or Chaos, a now defunct UFO association has a stand. One morning, the author of the article, who is one of the exhibitors at the stand, notices a modest man in his 60s in a white jacket who has listened to the same UFO lecture several times and who always pays particular attention when a slideshow on UFOs is shown. He walks up to the older man and starts making small talk. At first, it is very stiff because the man is very reserved. Eventually, however, he says, "I once talked to a man like the one in these pictures." When he realizes that the author of the article is neither laughing nor shaking his head, but is interested in the man's story, he continues to tell it. In 1955, I was working as a forestry worker on the Gulf of Bothnia, in the north of Sweden, with two brothers delivering timber to a sawmill in central Sweden. It was early one morning in July. It was about 6 a.m., and already very hot. We wanted to harvest our assigned lot as quickly as possible, and before the heat would completely kill us. We estimated that if we kept a fast pace and didn't take any breaks, we would be done just after lunch. Then we would cool off in the river, which could still be heard roaring between the trunks. I had just felled a large pine tree that the axe had wedged into several times and was wiping the sweat from my brow when I heard a cracking sound, as if a large animal was making its way through the forest. The next moment, both the brothers and I saw a cigar-shaped object zigzagging uncontrollably between the treetops as branches and leaves swirled down. My wildest thought was that it was a small airplane that had lost its wings and was now trying to make an emergency landing. There was a river about 300 to 400 meters away, and it was clear that the object was heading towards it. All three of us realized that the object would hit the ground within seconds, so we ran in the same direction. 15 to 20 meters before we came out of the forest, the object crashed close to the river. But what we had expected, a deafening roar as the gas tank exploded, did not come. Instead, a giant light illuminated the entire area, so bright that the sunlight almost disappeared. It was so powerful that I could actually see through the trees. Like an X-ray, I could see the growth rings inside a tree that was over a meter in circumference. A few seconds later, there was a vacuum wave that sucked everything towards the center of the light. We were thrown forward, all three of us, as branches and leaves swirled past us. It probably only lasted a fraction of a second. Time stood still, and my whole life flashed before my eyes. All the sounds around me no longer existed. When we had calmed down a bit, we went to the impact site to see what had happened, but there was nothing to see except some logs blown down by the wind. We were very surprised and decided to go back and continue our work. But when I got back to the edge of the forest, one of the brothers suddenly shouted, "There's a dwarf in uniform here!" The plane must have crashed into the river and he must have been thrown out of it. For a long time we stood speechless and stared at the lifeless figure. He was small in stature, about 110 centimeters tall. When one of the brothers wanted to see if the stranger was still alive, he withdrew his hand with a scream. He turned pale and said that it felt as if several hundred volts had passed through his body. At the same moment, the stranger opened his eyes and said in perfect Swedish, "Don't touch me. It will only be unpleasant for you." "Now you know who I am," he said. He knew in advance what we would answer and simply stated that his question had been correctly understood. Suddenly I became completely calm and I looked at him carefully. His body was harmonious with broad shoulders and a normal shape. His skin was yellowish. His eyes were deep set and completely black. He had 2 large wounds on his cheekbones and forehead. The wounds did not bleed, but were kind of watery. His hair was almost completely white. His earlobes were fused to his neck and looked like shark fins. His hands were small, with 5 narrow fingers without nails, and when he moved his hand it looked as if the ring finger had grown together with the little finger. His uniform was made of reddish metal and was tightly fitted to his body. The head and hands were not covered, but at the feet the suit merged into a kind of shoe. The soles of the feet were grooved and they vibrated, and for a moment I thought of the caterpillar feet of a tank. The stranger looked at me and nodded his head slightly. There was no doubt that he knew what I was thinking about. His shoes allowed him to roll back and forth without moving his legs. Around his waist, he wore a wide, luminescent metal belt with an unusually large buckle that glowed a light blue color, which later, when he was dead, turned dark blue. In the middle of the buckle was a kind of sign in yellow that resembled the letters U and V, and it looked like the V was inside the U. He knew I was studying him, and he said, "It is thanks to the suit that I am still alive. Inside I am completely destroyed." His right hand disappeared into the suit at the hip, but I saw no pocket. He took out a rectangular object. It was the size of a matchbox and had 12 small indentations. With a metal fork attached to the object, he stabbed the different holes several times. When he was done, he tried to throw the object away. He smiled and said, "Don't touch it. It will tell them what has happened so they can come and look for me. Where I come from, there is also someone waiting." The stranger then lay quiet a while as asleep. It was clear that he was in great pain. Suddenly the brothers looked at each other, a little confused, and without further ado they just walked back into the forest without a word. When I later, years later, reconstructed the story, I became convinced that the stranger somehow told the brothers to leave without saying a word. After the brothers had left, I sat down and talked to the stranger for 2 hours. The alien came from somewhere near the constellation we call the Eagle. Several intelligences from outer space visit us, and some are so advanced in their development that we can only see them when they materialize or dematerialize to visit a parallel universe in Earth's orbit. Some visit the Earth to take samples of the soil, with a view to settling here later. Some also have contact with people on Earth, and have had it for hundreds of years. The old man continued. Just before the stranger died, he gave me a folded sack from his invisible pocket and said, "When I die, the light will disappear from my body, and then you will pull this sack over me, and together with the other 2 men you will throw me into the river. Then I will disappear. Afterwards, you must rinse yourself well with water so that you don't get sick." He had difficulty breathing, and I saw that he did not have long to live. The light around his body grew dimmer, and the light blue buckle gradually darkened. He looked at me and smiled. Then he said something in a language I have never heard before or since. Then he said something in Swedish, and the last sentence I managed to understand was, "You have come against your will, and you go away without wanting to. Our life is like vapor." He said a few more words, but his voice was so weak that I could not understand what he said. But I am convinced that he prayed to some god before he died. I was moved. With the help of the 2 brothers, I put him in the sack, and we put him in the river. The sack smelled of sulfur, and he was quite heavy, probably between 90 and 100 kilograms. When the bag came into contact with the water, it started to sizzle and bubble around it, and we realized there was a chemical process going on. After 5 minutes, everything was gone. He had probably wanted to throw himself into the river for a quick death, rather than lie in pain on the riverbank for 2 hours. He probably wanted to die alone and think about his home, several light years out in the universe. "That's all," said the old man. "I worked a few more years with the brothers, but we rarely talked about what had happened. Both of them are dead now, but I remember it as if it had happened yesterday. Even though it has been 22 years since it happened, I recognized the stranger in one of the pictures. By the way, I thought I was the only one who knew about this kind of UFO, because I have seen many pictures and drawings of visitors from outer space, but I have never seen anyone who looked like him." The old man then took out a piece of metal. "Look," he said. He laughed confidently and said, "A few days after the incident, I walked around the site. The little box the stranger had thrown away was gone, but the metal fork was there in the grass, shining. I have kept it as proof that I did not dream what happened." He turned and left, and as the author of the article stood there gasping for breath, he disappeared into the crowd. An anonymous man who, with his story and his evidence, could be on the front page of any newspaper in the world. Yes, a story that makes you wonder how many similar stories that are out there. Stories we never get to hear because those who experience them are afraid to tell them for fear of being mistrusted or ridiculed. And saddest of all, many have probably followed their bearers to their graves. Stories lost, forever. We jump ahead 3 years to a night in a small cabin in southwestern Sweden, and one of the creepiest scenarios I can imagine. A strange window peeper. The Nordic summer nights are magical. It's no wonder that there are lots of stories about fairies, trolls, and wood nymphs that emanates from these countries. Especially famous in Sweden is the Nix. The Nix, or Näcken, is a mythological creature from Scandinavian folklore who is known for playing enchanting music on the fiddle, often while sitting naked in a stream or brook. His music is said to lure people, particularly children, to come closer, where they risk being drowned. But the Nix is not just fiction. It represents the true danger of tempting your fate and shows how beautiful scenery might lull you into a false sense of security. Behind the veneer of the seemingly tranquil and harmonious, there is always the risk of predation, survival, and sudden change. Do bright nights of summer reveal the secrets of the dark? This story takes us all the way back to 1958, and it's interesting because the observation was made by a person who likely hadn't been exposed to phenomena like flying saucers and aliens through any sort of media. Observations from that time therefore have something innocent about them. However, it should also be said that the stigma around talking about such experiences was much stronger back then than it is today. We pull our story from the Swedish magazine UFO Information, issue number 4 from 1972. The man who experienced this tells the magazine himself about what he went through 14 years earlier. "At that time, I rented a small house from a farmer in Härja, Västergötland. I lived there with my family. The house was, as I said, small, and I therefore slept in the kitchen, an arrangement that wasn't entirely uncommon in the past. I was on vacation and allowed myself to pass evenings in bed and read late into the night. My craving for tobacco was just as strong at night as during the day, so I reached for my pipe and matches. At the same time, I glanced out the window, purely by chance. I then saw someone heading to the outhouse. I thought it must be Oscar, the farmer I rented the cottage from. I lit my pipe and picked up the book, but soon I got an intense feeling that someone was watching me. I turned my gaze back to the window, and to my horror, I was staring right into a face half a meter away. My brain quickly tried to rationalize the sight. It must be a human. It must be a tramp, I thought. It must be one of those vagrants who were skulking about the countryside and sneaking into barns, stealing a few hours of sleep unannounced. When I looked closer, there was something very strange about this figure. The face was surrounded by some sort of helmet that shone with a blue, cold light. The figure wore some kind of overall that shone in a similar way. Soon I noticed how short the figure was, like a boy of 11, 12 years old. The skin of its face was very light, and a pair of large, completely black eyes stared intensely at me. I froze in motion and was hypnotized by the being's intent gaze. For what could only have been seconds, but felt like minutes, I was immobile. My eyes were transfixed on its face and its cold, dark eyes. I felt the ice-cold fear drizzle down my neck. Suddenly, I broke free from my paralysis and the creature quickly left the window and ran away. I decided to chase the figure. I threw on my clothes and ran out of the house. When I got outside, it had already gotten about 100 meters away and must have jumped over a small fence at the back of the house. I ran along the road and saw the being out by the rye field to the left of the road. It was obvious that it was doing something there, but I couldn't see what. When I got closer to the rye field, the being rushed over to the wheat field on the other side of the road. I continued running towards the wheat field, and the being now disappeared down a slope. A slope where I stood and saw a disc-shaped object standing on a pair of telescope-like legs a bit further down. Just as soon, an unreal tiredness came over me, and at the same time, I felt a strange smell. The small creature climbed up a ladder right under the object. Soon, a sound was heard, like an electric motor starting, and the object slowly lifted. I was unable to move an inch. The object retracted its legs and disappeared at an enormous speed. Some nearby birches bent from the wind caused by its departure. As soon as my bodily paralysis released, I smell ozone. I take a deep breath, and there it is. A sharp, almost metallic tang that cuts through the usual smells. It's as if the air itself has been charged with a kind of electric energy. I close my eyes, and the scent grows more distinct, reminiscent of chlorine but more complex, more alive. Stunned by the experience, I stumble back to the cottage and tell my wife, who in no uncertain terms told me that she thought I had dreamed it all. She did not want to give weight to the story and wanted me to brush it off. It made me almost want to doubt myself. Could it have been something else? A heat stroke or a hallucination induced by the strange smell of ozone? The next morning, I was up at 5:30 and I went to Oscar, who I rented the house from. He was milking the cows. Not even Oscar believed me, but he still followed me to the rye field where we saw that a part of the rye was cut off about 10-12 centimeters from the top. The wheat field was trampled, and where the object had stood, we saw 3 holes that together formed a triangular shape in the ground. Then, Oscar seriously took into consideration what I had been through and began to ponder what it all really could mean. He knew my character well enough to reckon I was a stand-up person who would not easily fabulate or fabricate such a story. Perhaps this incident that reportedly took place in 1958 now makes you look at the rolling hills, lush forests, and undulating farmland in Sweden in a new light. If you visit and come upon the traditional Swedish houses painted in the classic red with white trims, the ancient stone walls, left from medieval times, and the old churches, you might think it's the epitome of a serenely close-knit community embedded within ageless tranquility. But we never know what storms our predecessors might have weathered in such places, being as surprised as we are that there are still mysteries, still questions beyond the given. Thank you for watching this special episode. In the next part, we'll explore our episodes featuring events from the 1970s.